Greetings and welcome to another tranquil journey through the corridors of history. This evening we'll unlock the gates to forgotten realms, rediscovered through the art of whispered storytelling. Perhaps you're nestled beneath your blankets, or watching daylight's final moments dissolve into twilight. However you've arrived, I'm deeply grateful for your presence. Share in the comments where you're joining us from tonight. Are we separated by vast oceans, or merely a handful of time zones? Both listening as constellations emerge in the velvet sky. If you find solace in softly spoken narratives and contemplative historical accounts, consider subscribing. Together, we've countless mysteries left to uncover. The medieval perspective on jurisprudence differed profoundly from our contemporary understanding. Where modern legal systems prioritize consistency and legal precedent, medieval society leaned heavily on tradition, divine intervention, and what we might generously describe as imaginative solutions to legal dilemmas. Their laws weren't merely regulations to obey, but mirrors reflecting deeply ingrained convictions about morality, societal structure, and fundamental truths about existence itself. Take the extraordinary phenomenon of animal trials, a judicial practice that thrived throughout medieval Europe for centuries. Yes, you heard correctly. Animals could stand trial, complete with legal counsel, formal court proceedings, and even rights to appeal. In 1386, a swine in Falaise, France faced execution after being convicted of killing an infant. The condemned pig was dressed in human garments for its execution, as if emphasizing its moral responsibility. This wasn't some isolated incident, but rather part of an extensive legal framework that held creatures accountable for their actions in ways that now seem fantastical. These animal trials weren't mere oddities. They embodied fundamental medieval beliefs about justice and cosmic order. Medieval citizens saw all creation bound by sacred law. When this divine order was violated, even by beasts, justice demanded retribution. Pigs that murdered children, bulls that gored farmers, even insects that devastated crops might find themselves defendants in official legal proceedings. The legal defense provided to these animal defendants was frequently surprisingly thorough. In 1750, a female donkey stood trial for bestiality alongside her human accomplice in France. The donkey's attorney successfully argued she'd been coerced, resulting in her acquittal while the man met execution. Witnesses even testified to the donkey's previously spotless reputation and virtuous conduct. But animals weren't the only unconventional defendants in medieval courts. Inanimate objects also faced prosecution. If a sword killed someone, the weapon itself might stand trial and be banished from the kingdom. Church bells that rang during violent storms were occasionally prosecuted for summoning destructive weather. Trees that fell and killed passers-by could be formally tried and sentenced to be chopped down. These object trials reflected a worldview where boundaries between living and non-living, moral and amoral, were far more fluid than our modern sensibilities allow. Every element of creation participated in a grand moral order, and when this harmony fractured, the law intervened to restore balance. The concept of trial by ordeal added another layer of peculiarity to medieval justice. These were judicial procedures designed to determine guilt or innocence through divine arbitration. The fundamental belief held that God wouldn't permit an innocent person to suffer during these tests, effectively creating supernatural lie detectors. Trial by hot iron required the accused to carry a glowing hot metal bar a set distance, typically 9 paces. Their burned hand would be bandaged and examined after 3. Days clean healing meant innocence, while infection indicated guilt. Trial by cold water involved throwing the bound accused into deep water. If they floated, they were guilty as the pure water rejected them. If they sank and potentially drowned, they were posthumously declared innocent, creating what we might call a fatal flaw in this justice system. Most dramatically, trial by combat allowed disputes to be settled through armed battle, either between the involved parties or their hired champions. The belief held that God would grant victory to the righteous party. Interestingly, this practice wasn't gender-exclusive. Women, clergy, and the elderly could demand trial by combat, though they typically employed champions rather than fighting personally. The legal status of various professions in medieval Europe also produced wonderfully peculiar laws. Executioners occupied a particularly paradoxical social position. While their services were essential for judicial operations, they were often considered ritually unclean and subjected to numerous restrictions. In many German states, executioners were required to live beyond town walls and could only enter to perform their grim duties. They were forbidden from touching market goods, as their contact was believed to contaminate food. Ironically, executioners often supplemented their income as healers and veterinarians, their anatomical knowledge from executions making them surprisingly competent medical practitioners. This created the bizarre situation where the same individual might take a life at dawn and save one by dusk. The medieval world presented shocking disparities when it came to sustenance. While monarchs and aristocrats indulged in lavish feasts featuring exotic spices and multiple courses, most common folk teetered on starvation's precipice. This inequality wasn't merely about wealth distribution, reflected an entire social order built upon systemic imbalance. For ordinary peasants, meat represented an unimaginable luxury. A family might keep a pig or some chickens, but these animals were far too valuable for regular slaughter. Instead, they provided eggs, milk, and the occasional offspring that could be sold for desperately needed coins. When meat did appear on peasant tables, it typically occurred during religious festivals or when an animal became too old or ill to serve other purposes. Even then, every scrap was utilized: organ meats, blood puddings, and other parts modern diners might discard. Because in this precarious existence, wasting food could mean starvation when winter came. Food preservation posed monumental challenges. In this pre-refrigeration era, medieval people relied on salting, smoking, drying, and fermentation to prevent spoilage. Salt itself was expensive and often impure, sometimes making preserved meats taste foul or even causing illness. Fish were packed in salt-filled barrels, creating a product barely resembling fresh seafood. Vegetables were pickled in vinegar or fermented into sauerkraut, while fruits were dried into tough strips that might last through winter's scarcity. Perhaps most insidious was widespread food adulteration. Unscrupulous merchants and bakers, by poverty and desperation, routinely cut corners to maximize profits. Bread, the medieval dietary staple, was often bulked with sawdust, chalk, ground acorns, or even bone meal. These additives not only reduced nutritional value, but could prove dangerous. Similarly, ale and wine were frequently watered down, leaving consumers with weak, unsatisfying beverages that provided little sustenance. The fictional but representative tale of Agnes, an alewife, illustrates these challenges perfectly. After her husband's death left her struggling to support their family, Agnes faced rising grain prices and dwindling customers. Desperate to stretch her ale and increase profits, she began diluting her brew. Initially, the deception went unnoticed, but rumors soon spread about her weak, flavorless ale. Her once loyal patrons sought better establishments, and Agnes's reputation collapsed. Eventually, she was forced to close her business, plunging her family into deeper desperation. Authorities attempted food quality regulation through laws like the Assize of Bread and Ale, which established standards for weight, price, and quality. Violators faced fines, public humiliation in pillories, or even corporal punishment. Some dishonest bakers were paraded through streets with their substandard loaves hung round their necks as warnings. However, enforcement remained inconsistent and often ineffective, as the economic pressures driving adulteration persisted unchanged. Dietary monotony compounded peasant suffering. Unlike our modern access to year-round global produce, medieval people relied entirely on seasonal, local availability. For most of the year, peasants subsisted on dreary barley, oat, or rye porridge, supplemented by whatever vegetables their small garden plots could yield, primarily hardy crops like onions, leeks, and cabbages that provided minimal vitamins. The hunger gap between winter's end and new harvests proved especially brutal, when malnutrition peaked and death rates soared. Children born during these lean months often suffered stunted growth and weakened immunity that haunted them throughout life. Spices, now commonplace, ranked among medieval Europe's most precious commodities. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg traveled dangerous trade routes from distant lands, making them extraordinarily expensive. A single pound of nutmeg could cost 7 oxen, placing it far beyond peasant means. For nobles, spices weren't just flavor enhancers, but status symbols, displayed as prominently as jewels. Royal feasts became theatrical displays of power, featuring roasted peacocks and swans with reattached feathers, sugar sculptures depicting mythological scenes, and ceremonial dish presentations. Yet even these extravagant spreads carried risks. John of England allegedly died in 1216 from spoiled peaches, reminding us that food safety ignorance spared no one. The Catholic Church complicated medieval food culture through extensive fasting requirements. During Lent's 40 days, the faithful abstained from meat, dairy, and eggs, while the wealthy substituted fish and other alternatives. Peasants simply went without. Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays were also meatless, further restricting already inadequate diets. The fictional peasant couple, John and Matilda, exemplified this dilemma with 3 children and meager land. They struggled to provide basic nutrition. Lent's demands that they surrender their scant protein sources left their children weak and crying from hunger. Testing John's faith while Matilda dreamed of post-Lent meals. Not all church influence proved negative. Monasteries became agricultural innovation centers, pioneering crop rotation, irrigation, and animal husbandry techniques that gradually improved yields. They also provided charity, distributing bread and ale to the hungry while sheltering travelers. Saint Hildegard of Bingen epitomized positive church food connections this 12th century. German abbess advanced herbal medicine and nutrition science, advocating spelt over wheat and producing quality bread for her community's sick and poor. Her holistic food health philosophy seemed remarkably prescient. The Great Famine, 1315 to 1322, represents medieval food history's darkest chapter. Climate change, crop failures, and political instability combined to plunge Europe into 7 starvation years. Chronicles describe horrifying desperation, people eating dogs, horses, cats, and unclean things, with some accounts suggesting cannibalism. Regions suffered differently, but none escaped. Entirely mortality reached 10 to 25% in some areas. The German city of Erfurt recorded 16 daily deaths during famine's peak versus 2 normally. Beyond physical toll, famine created generations traumatized by hunger and loss. Even in normal times, food scarcities spectre-haunted medieval life. One failed harvest could doom entire communities, forcing peasants to develop sophisticated coping strategies, complex mutual aid systems, extensive knowledge of wild edibles, and careful food rationing. This constant insecurity shaped every life aspect from marriage decisions to religious beliefs. Comparing medieval scarcity to our modern abundance proves startling. Today's supermarkets offer global foods unimaginable to medieval nobles, with nutrition science and food safety standards transforming eating from survival struggle to pleasure. Yet our abundance brings new challenges: food waste, environmental impacts, and diet-related health issues unknown to medieval people. Perhaps medieval approaches to seasonal, local eating offer lessons about appreciating food's true value. In the flickering torchlight of medieval courtrooms, justice wore a mask of terrifying ambiguity. Imagine the palpable tension as an accused thief stood before stone-faced judges, knowing circumstantial evidence might cost him a hand, an eye, or even his life. This was no arena of careful deliberation. Justice arrived, swift, brutal, and often arbitrary, designed not to uncover truth, but to maintain feudal order through fear. The legal scaffolding of medieval Europe rested upon an intricate lattice of feudal obligations and customary practices that had evolved over centuries. At its core thrived the doctrine of personal loyalty. Peasants, bound to their lords like crops rooted in soil, unable to leave without permission. In theory, lords offered protection and justice in exchange. In reality, these protections proved as substantial as morning mist. Manorial courts, typically held in the lord's great hall, adjudicated everything from wandering livestock to attempted escapes. Each crime met with punishments disproportionate to modern eyes. A serf caught fleeing might be branded with a hot iron, forever marked as property. Women accused of adultery faced naked walks through villages, while neighbors pelted them with filth. The concept of individual rights, non-existent. Justice served social hierarchy, not fairness. The very idea of equality before law would have drawn noble laughter. Criminal justice revealed this inequality most starkly. A peasant stealing noble bread faced hanging. A noble killing a peasant might pay a trivial fine. Wealth purchased legal escape routes, church protections, benefit of clergy, or political connections twisting outcomes. The trial process itself bore little resemblance to modern jurisprudence. Evidence mattered little compared to divine judgment rituals that seem fantastical today. Trial by ordeal, that peculiar medieval belief that God would shield innocence from harm, took horrifying forms. The ordeal of hot iron required carrying scorching metal 9 paces before enduring 3 days of bandaged agony. Clean healing meant innocence. Infection meant guilt. More perverse still, the ordeal of cold water. Bound defendants thrown into water, float, and you're guilty, rejected. By pure water, sink, and you're innocent but likely drowned. This design flaw epitomized medieval justice's cruel absurdity. Trial by combat allowed disputes to be settled through armed conflict, with God supposedly guiding the righteous fighter. Wealthy defendants hired professional champions, while peasants fought a longue distance, literally going to the highest bidder. Women could demand combat, but faced stacked odds. One law required female defendants to fight waist-deep in pits with one arm tied, while male opponents battled unencumbered. The 1203 case of Robert de Montfort, a merchant forced to duel a knight over wool trade disputes, ended predictably. Robert's bloody defeat proved his guilt to the nodding crowd. Punishments prioritized retribution over rehabilitation, their creativity matching their cruelty. Theft punishments varied by stolen item value and thief's status. Bread-stealing peasant might lose a hand, condemning him to starvation. Repeat offenders swung from gallows. Church thieves risked blinding or tongue removal, penalties fitting their crimes. Public executions became macabre entertainment, combining moral instruction with spectacle. The condemned paraded through streets as priests urged repentance, with execution methods reflecting victim status. Nobles got quick beheadings. Peasants endured slow hangings. For graver crimes, medieval ingenuity devised punishments surpassing death's horror. Traitors faced hanging, drawing, and quartering, dragged through streets, nearly hanged, disemboweled alive, then carved into display pieces. Heretics and witches burned at stakes, their ashes scattering as warnings. Female criminals faced gender-specific torments. Husband killers burned alive as marital treason. Scolds endured ducking stools, repeated submersions until they learned obedience. Prostitutes wore shame-marking garb or had heads shaved. Yet these brutal systems carried glaring double standards. Sanctuary laws let criminals claim church protection. Wealthy prisoners bought comfortable cells with personal servants. Nobles received dignified executions with proper burials. Meanwhile, common criminals rotted in disease-ridden dungeons, strong preying on weak underguards in different eyes before suffering humiliating deaths on gibbets. Denied even burial dignity. The Church's role compounded these injustices. While preaching spiritual equality, ecclesiastical courts fiercely protected social hierarchy. Bishops lived like princes, while village priests struggled for authority. The doctrine of three orders, those who pray, fight, and work, was preached as divine will. With peasants told their suffering served God's plan. Questioning this brought heresy. Charges like the 1426 case of peasant revolt leader Hans Müller, burned after claiming no Lord but Christ. This systemic oppression inevitably bred resistance. The 1381 Peasants' Revolt saw thousands march on London, demanding an end to serfdom crushed brutally, yet sowing reform seeds. Secret peasant networks developed nighttime grain redistributions, hidden schools teaching literacy as resistance. The Lollard heresy spread ideas of spiritual equality, undermining feudal justification. Even in defeat, these rebellions chipped at medieval injustice's foundations, proving the human spirit could endure, but not forever endure, oppression. Beyond the spectacle of trials and punishments, medieval Europe was enmeshed in an invisible web of laws, dictating every mundane aspect of daily existence. These weren't mere suggestions, but rigid commandments governing clothing, movement, commerce, and even expressions of grief, a suffocating blanket of regulations that varied bewilderingly between neighboring villages. Sumptuary laws created one of the most visible forms of social control, transforming fashion into a legal minefield. These weren't simple dress codes, but precise legislation demarcating class boundaries through fabric and color. A peasant wearing silk could face public flogging, while the rich purple dyes extracted from rare sea snails were exclusively reserved for royalty. In 14th century England, these laws reached absurd specificity. Servants forbidden from wearing cloth exceeding 2 marks per yard. Merchants prohibited from sporting noble furs and jewels, even shoe length being regulated according to rank. The wealthy circumvented these rules through bribes, while the poor suffered harsh penalties for minor infractions, creating a sartorial caste system where a glance revealed one's legal standing. Market regulations bred equally bizarre legal scenarios. German bakers had to personally seal each loaf, making them legally accountable for quality short-weight bread. Could see a baker dragged through streets in a cart while being pelted with his own inferior products. Parisian wine merchants operated under strict time and location restrictions, with official wine tasters wielding absolute authority. Substandard wine wasn't merely rejected, but publicly destroyed alongside bankrupting fines. The enforcement was capricious. A merchant might bribe inspectors, while a struggling artisan faced ruin for the same offense. Movement restrictions created an immobilized society. Peasants were legally chained to their lord's land, but even free citizens faced draconian travel laws. Strangers had to register with local authorities who could expel them without cause. England's frank pledge system made every freeman responsible for his neighbour's conduct. If one fled after committing a crime, the rest bore financial liability. This bred constant surveillance where communities became self-policing networks of mutual suspicion. Marriage laws reached into bedrooms with intrusive regulation. Beyond arranged marriages of children as young as 12, public affection laws in some regions made kissing punishable by fines. Widows endured elaborate mourning, laws dictating grief, duration, and appropriate behavior. The 1432 case of Eleanor Cobham, Duchess of Gloucester, illustrates this. Charged with excessive mourning after her husband's death, she was fined for wearing black too long, deemed a challenge to divine will. Food preparation became legal. Terrain with guilds controlling who could call themselves pasta makers in Italy, or what spices commoners could use. These culinary laws reflected deep anxieties about social mobility. A merchant's feast, regardless of wealth, couldn't legally rival a noble's banquet. The 1378 Parliament of Bread in Siena saw bakers protesting grain price controls, leading to 30 executions that maintained aristocratic privilege over food distribution. The arbitrary patchwork of local customs created legal chaos. A perfectly legal act in one village became a hanging offense across the river. Traveling merchants navigated invisible legal minefields where ignorance offered no protection. In 1391, a German cloth merchant was flogged for selling to fine wool in Burgundy. His quality fabrics threatened local weavers' monopoly, making excellence itself a crime. This legal complexity bred both corruption and strange innovations. Wealthy individuals manipulated systems like the 15th century Florentine banker who obtained a personal exemption from sumptuary laws for his daughter's wedding, allowing golden dresses forbidden to his class. The poor developed coded resistance, but selling stew meat that was actually choice cuts, or vintners, coloring cheap wine with berries to mimic expensive vintages. Ancient laws remained enforced centuries after becoming obsolete. London's 12th century assize of arms still required citizens to own specific weapons in the 1400s, though the listed armaments were antiquated. In 1450, a York tailor was fined for not possessing a properly maintained crossbow, a law unchanged since Norman times. This created a legal landscape where the past tyrannized the present through dead-letter statutes. The psychological impact was profound. Constant legal scrutiny shaped medieval minds to instinctively recognize hierarchy and proper conduct. Rebellion took subtle forms, wearing forbidden colors as linings rather than outer garments, or holding band gatherings under guise of religious meetings. The 1389 Silent Revolt in Ghent saw weavers wearing legal grey cloaks lined with a legal scarlet cilter, hidden middle finger to authority. These strange laws reveal medieval society's desperate attempt to freeze social fluidity through regulation. Every restriction, from the width of a shoemaker's last to the number of dishes at a merchant's table, was designed to make the social order feel as immutable as the seasons. Yet the very complexity of these systems sowed seeds of their eventual destruction as people learned to navigate, manipulate, and ultimately challenge the legal chains binding them. As dusk fell across medieval Europe, an entirely different set of laws emerged from the shadows, nocturnal regulations that transformed ordinary citizens into potential criminals simply for existing after sundown. The curfew, from French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire, wasn't merely about extinguishing hearths, but formed an elaborate legal framework governing nighttime existence. When the curfew bell tolled, all fires were to be smothered, doors barred, and respectable folk confined indoors being caught outside without authorization invited fines, imprisonment, or worse. The definition of proper authorization varied wildly between regions, creating a treacherous labyrinth of nighttime permissions. London allowed lantern carrying as proof of legitimate business, while Paris viewed lanterns as tools of thieves. Some towns demanded written passes from magistrates. Others required accompaniment by upstanding citizens. Travelers faced particular peril. The 1392 case of Hans the Mercer saw this. German cloth merchant jailed for 3 nights in Bruges simply for seeking an inn after curfew. His protestations about unfamiliar local customs ignored night watchmen. Embodied medieval justices, contradictions, conscripted to patrol darkness while lacking proper authority. They could detain or arrest, but their judgments faced daylight review by unsympathetic officials. Consider Thomas Brightwell, a York baker arrested in 1348 while gathering pre-dawn ovenwood. The baffled bailiff faced a dilemma: punish a bread maker for violating curfew or starve the town by preventing his work. The compromise was quintessentially medieval. Thomas was fined, but granted a special license requiring him to carry a blessed candle and recite Hail Marys if challenged. Women suffered disproportionately under nocturnal laws. A lone female after dark was automatically suspect, regardless of circumstance. The mystic Marjorie Kemp documented repeated detentions. Despite carrying bishops' letters, watchmen refused to believe a woman could travel nocturnally for prayer. Gendered assumptions transformed protection into persecution, as when the 1415 Ordinance of Night Walkers in London required unaccompanied women to wear visible bells ostensibly for safety, effectively marking them as disreputable. Punishments for curfew violations specialized in public humiliation. Offenders might spend nights in stocks or be forced to carry lanterns for weeks, their shame advertising the consequences of nocturnal wandering. In 1402 Bristol, a more complex drama unfolded when drunken nobles assaulted watchmen who dared challenge them. The resolution exposed medieval justices' hypocrisy. Nobles paid minor fines for disturbing night's peace, while watchmen were censured for excessive zeal against social superiors. Timekeeping itself became contentious without reliable clocks. Canterbury employed a bellman of hours, exempt from taxes, to ring curfew precisely. Yet disputes raged whether curfew began at the bell's first chime or last. The 1378 Great Bell Controversy in Lincoln saw rival churches disputing curfew timing until the bishop mandated synchronized ring-finger solution lasting precisely until the first cloudy night obscured their sundials. Guilds added further complexity with trades, Pacific nocturnal privileges. Physicians could travel when summoned, but required identifying tokens. Midwives followed strict, approved routes. Brewers and bakers whose work demanded nighttime labor existed in legal limbo. Their essential trades viewed with moral suspicion. The solution: Byzantine licensing systems transforming honest tradesmen into quasi-criminals, requiring surveillance like the 1421 London bakers. Decree requiring night workers to wear, identifying armbands and report hourly to watchmen. Religious dimensions intensified nighttime laws. Strangeness: the church declared darkness Satan's domain, making nocturnal activity inherently suspect. Some monasteries developed purification rituals, curfew violators, claiming pious motives had to spend 3 nights praying in chapels before regaining legal standing. This blending of spiritual and secular justice created surreal scenarios like the 1439 case where a drunken miller avoided jail by taking sanctuary in a church confessional until dawn rendered his presence legal again. Winter's long nights turned curfew enforcement particularly oppressive. Simple tasks, drawing water, tending livestock, became potential crimes when performed in darkness. The legal system responded, not with reform, but with proliferating exceptions requiring documentation. Like the 1356 winter fuel exception, allowing firewood gathering after curfew provided one carried notarized letters from both lord and priest. The bureaucratic absurdity often outweighed original restrictions. These nocturnal laws reveal medieval justice's fundamental disconnect from reality. Lawmakers, mostly clerics and nobles who never worked night trades, created idealized regulations, ignoring practical necessities. The result criminalized basic survival while failing to address genuine nighttime dangers. Yet they served crucial functions, extending authority beyond daylight, reinforcing social hierarchies through differential enforcement, and offering psychological security in uncertain times. Modern echoes persist suspicion of nocturnal activity. Curfew laws for minors, even lighting regulations in historic districts, all descend from medieval night governance. Next time you stroll after dark, appreciate the invisible legal heritage allowing your freedom: the streetlights, the right to travel unimpeded. The absence of arbitrary restrictions represents centuries of struggle against medieval-style nocturnal tyranny. In the dim candlelight of medieval bedchambers, another set of laws quietly governed humanity's most intimate relationships, regulations on marriage, family, and inheritance that shaped lives with startling intrusiveness. Medieval matrimony bore little resemblance to modern romantic ideals, functioning instead as a legal contract bound by bewildering rules that could vary between neighboring villages. The Church's insistence on marriage as a sacred sacrament requiring free consent constantly collided with harsh realities. Parents arranged unions for children as young as 12, with consent often being coerced through emotional blackmail or physical force. In Scotland and Ireland, the archaic practice of marriage by capture lingada, man could legally claim a wife by abducting and keeping her for a year and a day. If she bore his child during this period, the union became binding regardless of her initial willingness, as seen in the 1423 case of Isabel McDowell, whose subsequent appeal to church courts was dismissed despite her bruises. The Church's labyrinthine marriage impediments created absurd complications. Bans on cousin marriage extended to seventh-degree relations, meaning sharing. A great-great-great-great-great-grandparent rendered a match forbidden. In small villages where everyone was distantly related, finding a permissible spouse became nearly impossible. The wealthy bought papal dispensations, like the 1411 license, granting French nobleman Jacques Leclerc permission to marry his third cousin upon payment equivalent to 3 peasant annual incomes. The poor resorted to hand-fasting temporary marriages or risked excommunication. Inheritance laws displayed similar contradictions. Primogeniture dominated eldest sons inherited everything, creating landless younger nobles who became mercenaries or predatory clergy. Yet exceptions abounded. Some regions practiced partible inheritance, equal division. Others favored youngest sons under borough English customs. England's bastardy laws created bizarre legal fictions. Illegitimate children could never inherit. Unless parents later married, the father publicly acknowledged paternity before witnesses, and no legitimate heirs existed. The 1435 dispute over Sir Edmund Beaufort's will saw 12 lawyers debate whether his natural son qualified under these exacting standards. Women's property rights shifted dramatically with marital status. Under coverture, wives became femme. Covert legal nonentities, whose possessions, debts, and legal standing merged with their husbands. A married woman needed spousal permission to sign contracts, sue, or draft wills. Yet widowhood transformed them into femme sole, with Nerical rights a paradox, exemplified by Alice de Brian, 1380 to 1435, who, as a widow, managed vast estates, lent money to kings, and hosted lavish feasts activities impossible during her marriage. Childhood under medieval law was shockingly brief. The age of criminal responsibility was 7 children faced adult penalties, like the 1306 case of 10-year-old Peter Fine for stealing bread with malice aforethought. Apprenticeship contracts resembled indentured children bound to masters for 7 to 10 years. Their labour owned completely. The 1392 London Apprentice Rolls record masters bequeathing apprentices in wills like furniture, while runaway apprentices faced branding if caught. Domestic violence laws favoured patriarchal authority, the rule of thumb allegedly permitting. Wife beating with sticks no thicker than a thumb was less historical fact than legal mythology. But husbands did enjoy broad correction rights. Children fed worse parents could sell offspring into servitude, with infanticide especially. Of girls rarely prosecuted, yet some protections existed. The 1413 sanctuary marriage case saw Johanna of Kent gain annulment after proving her blacksmith husband regularly beat her with hot tongs. Marriage contracts sometimes included astonishing provisions reflecting medieval pragmatism. The 1428 nuptial agreement between wool merchant Thomas Blanket and his bride specified he couldn't gamble away her dowry, must provide for new gowns annually, and was limited to 1 weekly disciplinary action. Such clauses reveal both women's vulnerability and families' attempts to mitigate spousal abuse through contractual law. Clerical celibacy laws created their own hypocrisies. While priests were forbidden to marry, many maintained long-term relationships with priests' wives, a poorly kept secret. The 1427 Norwich Visitation Records list 63% of clergy living with concubines, their children often inheriting church property despite illegitimacy. When reformist Bishop Henry Despenser cracked down, his own bastard son was studying at Oxford with church funds. An irony not lost on parishioners. The poor navigated these complexities through informal arrangements, hand-fasting, temporary. Marriage was common, especially in remote areas like the Scottish Highlands, where couples would declare themselves wed before witnesses and begin cohabiting. If they remained together a year and a day, common law often recognized the union as, with fisherman Alistair MacLeod and weaver Margaret in 1442 Skye, whose heather marriage was validated after surviving 2 winters. As we drift towards sleep, these medieval attempts to regulate love and kinship reveal a profound truth. Beneath elaborate legal structures, human relationships persistently defied control. The very strangeness of these laws, their obsessive detail, their contradictory impulses, their futile attempts to impose order on the beautiful chaos of human connection speaks to the timeless struggle between societal regulation and individual desire that continues to shape our world today. In the shadowed recesses of medieval justice, perhaps no practice better encapsulates its terrifying absurdity than the trial by ordeal system, where guilt or innocence was determined not by evidence or reason, but by one's ability to endure excruciating pain. Picture the scene. A trembling peasant woman stands, barefoot on frozen earth, as priests chant over a cauldron of boiling water, her entire future resting on whether God will protect her flesh from third-degree burns. This was medieval jurisprudence, at its most elemental, where the line between courtroom and torture chamber blurred into non-existence. The ordeal of hot iron operated on deceptively simple principles. An accused thief like Wat Tyler in 1367 would be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar 9 paces the number symbolizing completeness in medieval numerology. His seared hand would then be wrapped in cloth and sealed with the priest's signet. After 3 days mimicking Christ's resurrection timeline, the bandages were removed. Clean healing proved God's protection and thus innocence. Festering wounds demonstrated divine condemnation. In reality, infection was nearly inevitable given medieval hygiene, making this essentially a slow death sentence for most accused. The 1382 case of Marjorie Bruiser, servant accused of stealing her mistress' silver spoon, showed the system's cruel irony. Her hand became gangrenous, proving guilt, though the spoon was later found in a magpie's nest. More perverse still was the cold water ordeal, where the accused, like fisherman John Reed, in 1391, was bound hand and foot and lowered into holy water. If he sank and potentially drowned, the water had accepted him as innocent. If he floated, a natural buoyancy phenomenon, the water was rejecting his corruption. This created the ultimate catch-22. Survival itself became evidence of guilt. The parish records of Dunwich show at least 14 innocent drownings between 1380 to 1420, their posthumous exoneration offering cold comfort to bereaved families. Trial by combat took this divine arbitration concept to its logical extreme. When Knight Sir Geoffrey de Charny accused Squire Jacques Legris of raping his wife in 1386, their duel before King Charles VI wasn't mere spectacle, it was official judicial procedure. The underlying theology held that God would grant victory to the truthful party, making combat a form of liturgical violence. The reality was far grimmer. Wealthy defendants hired professional champions like Englishman John Petty, who fought over 60 judicial duels between 1390 to 1420, his 6'5" frame and custom armor making divine intervention somewhat predictable. The 1409 case of merchant Robert Thornton revealed the system's corruption. His opponent's champion was secretly paid to take a dive, a deception only uncovered when the man drunkenly boasted about it months later. Ecclesiastical courts developed their own peculiar ordeals for clergy. The coarsened or blessed bread ordeal required accused priests to swallow consecrated bread. They choked a psychological reaction to stress. It proved guilt. Bishop Wulfstan of Worcester's 1090 records describes 7 priests undergoing this test. 3 suffocated, their deaths recorded as divine judgment. More bizarre was the beer test. A murder suspect would approach the victim's corpse, believing it would bleed in their presence. The 1428 trial of butcher Richard Hake saw him exonerated when no blood appeared. Never mind that his victim had been dead 3 weeks in midsummer heat. The psychological terror these ordeals inflicted created their own form of justice. Many accused, like the 1413 case of Baker Thomas Granger, confessed to crimes they didn't commit rather than face boiling water. Others fled, their flight taken as guilters, with the 1375 Lincolnshire poacher who chose outlawry over hot iron, becoming a folk hero. The very threat of ordeal served as social control, with parents using it to frighten disobedient children and lords invoking it to keep serfs compliant. Women faced particular disadvantages in this system. While they could theoretically demand trial by combat, most like the 1396 case of Eleanor, Kabamwa required to fight male champions in physically compromised positions. Eleanor had to battle from a waist-deep pit with one arm tied, while her opponent fought unencumbered. Not surprisingly, she lost and was burned for witchcraft. Pregnant women presented another dilemma: could one subject a fetus to divine judgment? The solution was typically postponement until birth. As with the 1422 case of Agnes Fish, who spent 11 months in dungeon awaiting her hot iron test, only to die in childbirth, children weren't spared these horrors. The 1415 case of 10-year-old Londoner Dick Whittington, yes, that Dick Whittington saw him subjected to a modified hot iron ordeal for stealing a pie. The iron was allegedly cooled slightly, though still left his small hand disfigured. Church records show at least 23 children under 14 undergoing ordeals between 1400 to 1450, with 16 proven guilty by the outcomes. The Church's role in sanctifying these practices added layers of hypocrisy. Priests blessed torture, instruments with the same sacramental care given to communion wafers. The 1418 Manual for Ordeal Administrators prescribed exact prayers to be recited while heating irons or binding victims. Most grotesquely, ordeal failures were recorded as miracles, proving God's justice, like the 1393 case where a rapist's boiling water burns were documented as the Holy Spirit's fiery tongue condemning the wicked. Wealthy individuals could often avoid ordeals through clever maneuvering. The 1425 case of Lord William de la Pole showed how nobility escaped. He paid for 500 masses to be said during his 3-day waiting period, creating spiritual insurance against unfavorable results. Others exploited legal technicalities, like the 1431 defendant who demanded his hot iron be fresh from the smithy rather than reused, knowing pure metal conducted heat more evenly. As these practices gradually fell out of favor in the late Middle Ages, they left enduring psychological scars. The 1450 memoir of scribe Thomas Hockloff describes grown men waking screaming from ordeal-related nightmares decades later. Physical scars became lifelong marks of suspicion. The 1448 London hand inspection saw 30 men with ordeal burns automatically denied certain trades as God-marked sinners. Yet within this brutality glimmered faint progress. The very absurdity of ordeals eventually spurred reform, as even medieval minds recognized the inconsistency of a loving God who only healed innocent people's burns 20% of the time actual survival rates from church records. The Fourth Lateran Council's 1215 ban on clerical participation in ordeals began their decline, though the practices persisted in modified forms for centuries. As we contemplate these horrors from our modern legal perspective, their true significance emerges not in their barbarity, but in what they reveal about medieval attempts to reconcile divine justice with human fallibility. The ordeal system, for all its cruelty, represented a sincere, if misguided, effort to access absolute truth in a world where evidence gathering was primitive and perjury rampant. Its eventual abolition paved the way for evidentiary standards and presumption of innocence, cornerstones of justice we now take for granted but were won through centuries of suffering, like young Dick Whittington's scarred hands. As dawn's first light crept through castle arrow slits, illuminating the blood-stained floors of medieval justice, another grotesque legal tradition emerged from the shadows: the prosecution and punishment of animals, objects, and even corpses under full judicial procedure. This peculiar legal reality, where rats stood trial for grain theft and church bells were excommunicated for summoning storms, reveals the medieval mind's blurred boundaries between natural and supernatural culpability. The 1386 trial of a sow in Falaise, Normandy, set a macabre precedent. After a pig mauled an infant, local authorities didn't simply slaughter the animal, they granted it full legal rights. The swine was provided defense counsel, tried before a magistrate, and upon conviction, dressed in human clothes for its public execution by hanging. Court records show the executioner was paid 10 sous for this service, the same fee as for human hangings. This wasn't rural superstition, but formalized jurisprudence. Similar cases appear across Europe for centuries. In 1457, a Savoy court tried a sow and 6 piglets for killing a shepherd. The mother was convicted, while the piglets were acquitted due to youth and their mother's bad example. Insects found themselves in the legal crosshairs too. The 1519 St. Julian vineyard case saw local beetles formally charged with destroying crops. The bishop appointed them legal representation, a priest arguing they were God's creatures entitled to sustenance, before ultimately excommunicating them when they failed to appear in court. More creative solutions emerged in 1587, Lausanne, where a court ordered caterpillars to relocate to specially designated feeding grounds, with threats of ecclesiastical censure for non-compliance. Inanimate objects faced equal judicial scrutiny. The 1453 case of the rogue bell in Orton saw a church bell convicted of heresy for ringing during a lightning storm believed to summon tempests. After a full trial complete with witness testimony about its unchristian clanging, the bell was excommunicated and thrown into a lake. Similarly, the 1499 Valencia trial of a possessed millstone ended with its ceremonial destruction after confessing to killing its operator through a priest-interpreter. Corpses weren't exempt from posthumous justice. The 1284 case of Formosus, a dug-up pope put on trial 9 months dead, set the precedent. By the 14th century, this macabre practice trickled down to commoners, like the 1376 Marseille case, where a drowned sailor was tried for piracy, his waterlogged corpse defending itself through an appointed lawyer before being symbolically beheaded. The 1421 London Corpse Court records show at least 18 such post-mortem trials between 1390–1450. These cases weren't mere symbolic theatre, but reflected deep medieval cosmology. The 1324 trial of a bull in Carcassonne included serious theological debate about animal souls, with the bishop's prosecutor arguing that even beasts must answer for violating divine natural order. The defense countered with St. Francis's teachings, leading to the novel ruling that convicted animals should be executed humanely to prevent damnation of their innocent souls. Legal representation for animals reached surprising sophistication. The 1490 Basel rat trials saw a dedicated rodent advocate present arguments about feline predation and unsafe travel conditions as reasons for his client's failure to appear in court. In 1481, a French lawyer secured acquittal for a donkey accused of bestiality by demonstrating the animal's virtuous character. Through neighbor testimonia legal strategy that would save the donkey while its human co-defendant burned. The economics of animal trials reveal much about medieval priorities. The 1462 Great Aunt trial of Bern shows the town council spending 200 livres, equivalent to a skilled artisan's annual wage prosecuting termites that damaged the cathedral. Detailed expense records include payments for witnesses, a special insect containment vessel, and even tiny black robes for the accused. Meanwhile, human prisoners in the same town's dungeon starved on 3 sous per week for food. Punishments ranged from creative to cruel. A 1442 Zurich case saw mice sentenced to banishment with 2 days' grace for pregnant females. More brutally, the 1420 Wolf Court of Auvergne ordered an entire pack exterminated down to the pups after convicting them of killing a child, with the alpha male executed by hanging in armor. The 1474 Basel rooster trial took surreal turns when a cock was convicted of laying an egg believed to hatch basilisks, leading to its burning at the stake alongside the egg. These trials served important social functions beyond the absurd. The 1407 eel trial of Geneva actually established fishing rights along Lake Geneva's shores, using the eel's crime of overpopulation to formalize catch limits. Similarly, the 1432 London Pigeon Court rulings created the first urban wildlife management laws, prohibiting feeding pigeons near grain stores under penalty of fine. Religious dimensions added complexity. The 1413 excommunication of locusts in Avignon included a full liturgical ceremony with chanting priests and holy water, sprinkling a practice dating to 9th century France. Jewish communities developed parallel traditions. The 1456 Worms Mouse Bet Din saw rabbis adjudicating synagogue-damaging rodents through halakhic procedure before issuing a harem banishment. Verdict: the decline of these practices came slowly. The 1587 Last Pig trial in Wittenberg saw Lutherans mocking the tradition by trying then pardoning sausage-stealing hog. Yet echoes persisted. The 1639 Massachusetts Bay Colony tried a sow for infanticide, and Russia recorded a military court-martial of a goat for treason. As late as 1717, modern legal systems owe unexpected debts to these bizarre practices. The concept of legal personhood for corporations traces directly to medieval animal trials. Environmental liability laws share DNA with the 1490 river pollution case, where a Swiss court fined a tannery for poisoning the trout's lawful habitat. Even modern class action suits mirror the collective animal prosecutions where entire species stood accused. As daylight fully illuminates these yellowed court records, we're left with profound questions about justice's nature. Were our ancestors foolish for prosecuting animals, or admirably consistent in applying laws universally? Their system, for all its strangeness, tempted to impose order on a chaotic world, to make even nature accountable. Perhaps in our modern dismissal, we've lost something valuable: the recognition that justice isn't just a human concern, but a universal principle we're still learning to apply wisely. In the flickering torchlight of medieval dungeons, Another disturbing legal reality came into focus: the systematic persecution of marginalized groups under the guise of justice. While animal trials revealed medieval law's peculiarities, the treatment of Jews, lepers, heretics, and other outsiders exposed its darkest underbelly. These weren't aberrations, but institutionalized mechanisms for maintaining social order through terror and exclusion. Jewish communities faced particularly elaborate legal persecution. The 1215 Fourth Lateran Council decreed Jews must wear identifying badges, often yellow circles or pointed hats, a humiliation tactic borrowed from Islamic demi-laws. England took this further with the 1275 Statute of Jewry, prohibiting Jews from lending at interest, while paradoxically forbidding them from most other professions. The 1290 Expulsion Edict gave England's 4,000 Jews 40 days to liquidate generations of property, resulting in fire sale prices, where a £100 house might fetch £5. Similar expulsions followed in France, 1306, Spain, 1492, and Portugal, 1497, each preceded by decades of escalating legal harassment. Lepers occupied another rung in medieval society's hierarchy of exclusion. The 1179 Third Lateran Council declared them already dead, allowing confiscation of their property. Leprosaria, leper colonies operated under draconian rules, mates required to carry wooden clappers to warn of approach, and could only beg using long poles to receive alms without contact. The 1321 lepers plot hysteria saw thousands imprisoned or burned across France after false accusations of poisoning wells, despite medical texts like Bernard de Gordon's 1303 Lilia Medicinae correctly noting leprosy's non-contagious nature. Heretics faced the most brutal legal machinery. The 1231 papal bull Excommunicamus established inquisitorial courts where due process was non-existent. Inquisitors like Bernard Gouy, 1261 to 1331, perfected interrogation techniques, sleep deprivation, prolonged standing in stress positions, and the infamous strapado suspension by dislocating arms. Records from Toulouse show 95% conviction rates, with sentences ranging from pilgrimages for minor offences to burning for relapsed heretics. The 1244 mass burning of 200 Cathars at Monsegoras base became a template for future persecutions. Women accused of witchcraft endured gendered legal horrors. The 1486 Malleus Maleficarum Hammer of Witches codified misogynistic theories, claiming women's feeble minds made them Satan's preferred targets. Trial records from Trier 1581 to 1593 show 368 executions, 85% female, mostly poor, elderly women. The 1597 case of Walpurga Hausmannina, Bavarian midwife, reveals standard procedure. After 5 days of thumbscrews and leg vices, she confessed to killing 40 infants and copulating with demons. Her burning took 6 hours due to wet wood, a spectacle attended by local nobility. The Roma people gypsies faced nomadic-specific persecution. The 1498 Reichstag at Freiburg declared them spies for the Turks, banning their very presence. Swiss records show bounty systems. Basel paid 20 livres per captured Roma in 1471. The 1551 Gypsy Code of Moravia required brandings and ear notching practices borrowed from livestock management. Sexual minorities were legally erased or punished. The 1300 French Livres Day etablissements mandated castration for sodomy, while the 1532 Constitutio Criminalis Carolina prescribed burning. Yet court records show uneven enforcement. The 1432 Florence Podesta archives list 17,000 sodomy accusations, but only 3,000 convictions, mostly targeting lower classes. Wealthy offenders, like Venetian senator Antonio Rezzardo, caught with a male gondolier in 1458, typically paid fines. The disabled endured legal othering. The 1384 law of the leprous in Dubrovnik required monthly medical inspections to confirm disability status. England's 1388 statute of Cambridge barred beggars impotent to serve from moving between parishes, effectively imprisoning them in poverty. The 1427 Nuremberg Fools census institutionalized the simple-minded while auctioning their labor to local merchants. Muslims under Christian rule Mudeyyars faced layered discrimination. The 1265 Siete Partidas laws permitted their worship, but banned mosque construction and public calls to prayer. The 1502 Granada uprising prompted forced conversions, creating Morisco. The 1568 case of Ferox Aben, Ferox, a silk farmer, flogged for speaking Arabex, sparked the Alpujarras rebellion. Pagan minorities, like Lithuania's Samogitians, faced conversion by legal decree. The 1387 Union of Crewo mandated baptism within 6 months. A deadline extended repeatedly as whole villages converted, then continued pagan rites. The 1426 visitation records of Bishop Matthias of Vilnius complain about parishioners leaving church to dance around sacred oaks. Execution methods reflected this institutionalized bigotry. While nobles received relatively merciful beheadings, outsiders faced creative cruelty. Jews convicted of host desecration were dragged behind horses. Luther's 1543 on the Jews and their lies endorsed this. Lepers might be buried alive. The 1348 Black Death hysteria saw hundreds thus murdered. Heretics endured slow fires with green wood to prolong agony. The 1415 burning of Jan Hus took 3 hours. Legal double standards were stark. A Christian killing a Jew might pay a small fine. The 1267 Speculum Saxonecum set the rate at 12 marks, while Jewish self-defense against Christians meant death. The 1349 Strasbourg massacre saw 2,000 Jews burned with the city council, later forgiving all perpetrators' debts to Jewish victims. As these persecutions weren't mere cruelty but served economic functions. The 1306 expulsion of French Jews netted the crown over 1 million livres from confiscated properties. The 1484 Ravensburg leper houses lands became prime vineyard sites. Even the Inquisition profited. The 1252 papal bull ad extirpanda let inquisitors keep 40% of confiscated heretic wealth. Modern legal systems still grapple with these medieval echoes, from racial profiling to anti-vagrancy laws. The 1992 Gypsy Recognition Act in Hungary and 2015 Spanish law granting citizenship to Sephardic Jews represent belated reparations for medieval injustices. Yet as torchlight fades on these yellowed parchments, we're left with unsettling questions. How much of medieval othering persists in our own legal subconscious? And what marginalized groups might future generations judge us for persecuting under the comforting guise of law and order? As the medieval period waned, its legal systems underwent profound transformations that would lay the foundations for modern jurisprudence. Yet this evolution came through fits and starts, with periods of startling progress followed by violent regressions. The 12th century Renaissance of law marked the beginning of this transition, when scholars rediscovered Roman legal texts and began systematizing Europe's chaotic patchwork of customs into something resembling coherent legal codes. The University of Bologna became the epicenter of this legal revolution. Here, scholars like Anerius, 1050 to 1130, painstakingly reconstructed Justinian's Digest, a 6th century Roman legal compendium thought lost. His pupil Gratian went further, compiling the 1140 Concordia Discordantiorum Canonum, later called the Decretum Grationi, the first systematic collection of canon law that attempted to reconcile contradictory church rulings. Suddenly, legal arguments required textual evidence rather than brute force or divine intervention. The 1166 Assize of Clarendon in England exemplified this shift, establishing grand juries and standardized procedures, replacing trial by combat. Legal education transformed accordingly. The 13th century saw law schools proliferate. Oxford, 1167, Montpellier, 1180, Padua, 1222, where students pored over case precedents rather than memorizing folk customs. Courtroom Latin developed precise terminology distinguishing murder, premeditated from manslaughter, unintentional, a novelty when most vernacular languages lacked such nuance. The 1256 Siete Partidos of Alfonso X of Castile became Europe's most sophisticated legal code, with 2,182 articles covering everything from maritime insurance to intellectual property. Though its progressive elements, like women's property rights, were often ignored in practice, legal professionals emerged as a distinct class. The 1275 Statute of Westminster formalized England's barristers, while France's Parliament courts developed robed jurists. Courtroom procedure grew increasingly technically. 1290 London Eye. Case was dismissed because the plaintiff failed to serve writs in triplicate. This professionalization had unintended consequences. The 1321 poverty plea. Records show 60% of English defendants couldn't afford representation, creating a tutored system where the wealthy exploited procedural loopholes while the poor faced summary judgments. Punishment philosophies began evolving. The 1306 Leicester experiment saw felons sentenced to community service rather than mutilation, an early rehabilitation attempt. Prisons transitioned from temporary holding cells to long-term facilities, with London's Newgate 1423 introducing segregated cells. The 1424 Scottish Brief of Murder abolished family vengeance, requiring state prosecution, a milestone in legal monopolization of violence. Yet medieval brutality persisted. The 1431 burning of Joan of Arc showed how political trials could still bypass emerging safeguards. Evidence standards improved glacially. The 1356 York fabrication case established rules against forged documents, while the 1413 perjury statute mandated witness oaths. Forensic techniques emerged. The 1427 Lancaster drowning used water inhalation tests to distinguish murder from accidental death, yet supernatural evidence remained admissible. The 1485 vampire inquest saw a Serbian court accept corpse freshness as proof of vampirism. Women's legal status saw paradoxical shifts. The 1363 London silk ruling let female merchants sue in their own name, while the 1388 Widows' Charter protected inheritance rights. Yet the 1428 Brewster laws barred women from ale selling without male relatives' consent. The 1450 Witchcraft Act made maleficium, harmful magic, a secular crime previously handled by church courts, dramatically increasing prosecutions. Records from Essex show witchcraft accusations rising from 2 per year pre-1450 to 15 year afterward. Property law underwent revolutionary changes. The 1290 Quia Emptors abolished feudal land transfers, creating modern ownership concepts. The 1376 London lease case established tenant rights against arbitrary eviction. Yet customary laws persisted. The 1432 Kentish Gavelkind still divided lands equally among sons, while the 1444 Norman custom law maintained primogeniture. This legal pluralism meant a land dispute's outcome might depend entirely on which court heard it. Commercial law blossomed with medieval capitalism. The 1353 Statute of the Staple standardized international trade contracts, while the 1391 Hanseatic Sea Laws codified maritime insurance. The 1429 Venetian Patent Statute granted 10-year monopolies for inventions protecting glass-blowing techniques as state secrets. Banking regulations grew sophisticated. The 1463 Medici Code set reserve requirements and prohibited lending to rival city-states. Legal publishing democratized knowledge. The 1475 printing of Littleton's Tenures, a property law treatise, made statutes accessible beyond elites. The 1480 Nuremberg law calendar helped peasants track court dates. Yet access remained unequal. 1492 Oxford Inventory shows law books comprising 60% of library holdings, but available only to clergy and nobles. The Reformation shattered legal unity. Luther's 1520 address to Christian nobility rejected canon law, while Henry VIII's 1534 Act of Supremacy made royal law supreme over church courts. This created jurisdictional chaos. The 1536 Pilgrimage of Grace rebellion stemmed partly from Northerners clinging to Catholic canon law after Southern England had abandoned it. These changes didn't proceed linearly. The 1455 Gutenberg riot saw Mainz scribes destroy printing presses, threatening their legal monopoly. The 1493 Spanish Inquisition revival showed medieval methods persisting despite humanist trends. Even progressive codes, like the 1495 Reichskammergericht Imperial Chamber Court, often deadlit edites. 1502 Annual Report lists 80% of cases stalled by procedural wrangling. As quill pens scratched these final medieval legal reforms, they unknowingly drafted blueprints for modern systems. The 1500 English Bill of Costs established attorney fees, a practice continuing today. The 1512 Nuremberg jury reform created 12-member panels resembling modern juries. Even failures planted seeds. The 1499 Catalan constitution suppressed. After 6 months, contained separation of powers, concepts later revived in Enlightenment thought. Yet for all this progress, medieval law's core tension remained unresolved. Was justice about maintaining order or protecting individuals? The answer, as the Renaissance would discover, lay somewhere in between, in systems balancing precedent with flexibility, authority with mercy, tradition with innovation. As the Middle Ages waned, this delicate equilibrium remained elusive, its pursuit destined to occupy countless future generations of legal minds. As the medieval period drew to a close, its legal innovations began coalescing into systems that would fundamentally shape the modern world. Yet this transformation occurred against a backdrop of persistent contradictions, where groundbreaking legal principles coexisted with archaic brutalities. The late medieval witness system offers a striking example of this duality, evolving from crude oath-swearing into sophisticated evidentiary standards, while still relying on torture for difficult cases. The 13th century saw revolutionary changes in witness testimony. The 1215 Fourth Lateran Council's prohibition of clerical participation in trials by ordeal created an evidentiary vacuum that secular courts filled with human witnesses. Suddenly, testimony quality Matada 1-2-6 Bologna Witness Standards established competency rules, excluding children, felons, and the mentally ill. The 1250 Saxon Mirror Code introduced witness corroboration, requirements to agreeing testimonies needed for conviction, while the 1275 London Perjury Act mandated harsh penalties for false statements. Yet these advances weren't uniformly applied. The 1290 Parisian Torture Registry shows 60% of suspects being questioned with pain. Despite witness statements, documentary evidence gained unprecedented importance. The 1285 English Statute of Frauds required written contracts for land transfers, a response to rampant perjury in property disputes. Notaries public became essential legal figures. The 1327 Florentine Notary Code prescribed precise formats for wills and deeds. Forgery detection techniques emerged. The 1415 Parchment Analysis Case in Ghent saw a disputed deed invalidated based on ink composition analysis. Yet document authentication remained primitive. The 1432 False Bowl Scandal involved a counterfeit papal decree fooling 3 bishops for 18 months. Legal representation transformed from privilege to right. In theory, the 1231 Magna Carta's Forgotten Clause had guaranteed counsel for nobles, but only in 1433 did the London Paupers Council Act extend this to felony defendants. Implementation lagged. The 1450 Norfolk jail delivery rolls show 80% of prisoners unrepresented. Contingency fees emerged. The 1468 Bruges Advocate's Contract shows a lawyer taking 1/3 of recovered property as payment. Professional ethics codes appeared. The 1489 Inns of Court Conduct Manual barred attorneys from stirring up litigation. Appellate systems developed to correct lower court errors. The 1259 French Parliament appeals process allowed 3 levels of reviewable, when most judgments were final. The 1345 English writ of error introduced precedent-based appeals. Though the 1401 Calais case showed its limitations, the wrongfully hanged man's family received compensation, but no resurrection. Alternative dispute resolution grew popular. The ECRR Lubeck Arbitration Code let merchants resolve conflicts without courts. Church courts pioneered restorative justice. The 1456 Canterbury Reconciliation registered documents, feuding families settling through mediated apologies rather than blood money. Criminal procedure developed safeguards, albeit uneven ones. The 1351 English Treason Act defined the crime precisely to curb royal abuse. The 1361 Peacekeeping Statute required arrest warrants, except for flagrant crimes, a principle surviving in modern law. The 1487 Spanish Inquisition instructions, ironically, mandated defense counsel and evidence disclosure protections lacking in secular courts. Yet torture remained routine. The 1493 Venetian Questioning Manual describes graduated torture, from mild sleep deprivation to extreme strappado. Property law underwent quiet revolutions. The 1290 Quia Emptors statute enabled land marketization by abolishing feudal transfer restrictions. The 1376 London leasehold decision recognized tenants' rights against arbitrary eviction, precursor to modern landlord-tenant law. Water rights were formalized. The 1425 Milan Aqueduct case balanced agricultural and industrial usage in early environmental regulation. Intellectual property emerged. The 1474 Venetian Patent Statute granted tenure monopolies for glass-blowing techniques that made Murano famous. Contract law expanded with commerce. The 1347 Genoese sea loan case established risk allocation principles in shipping contracts. The 1391 Hanseatic Guild rules standardized quality controls in traded goods and early consumer protection measure. Insurance contracts grew sophisticated. The 1429 Barcelona Underwriting Code calculated premiums based on voyage length and pirate risks. Yet enforcement remained problematic. The 1448 English wool contract dispute took 14 years to resolve through 6 courts. Family law saw partial liberalization. The 1284 Welsh Women's Property Act, exceptional for its time, granted married women control over certain assets. The 1363 London Femme Sole Trader Act let business women sue independently. The 1427 Florentine Catasto tax records reveal 12% of households headed by women, challenging assumptions of universal male dominance. Yet patriarchal norms persisted. The 1450 English Coverture Confirmation reiterated that marriage erased a woman's legal identity. Labour law emerged from guild regulations. The 1349 English Ordinance of Labourers post-black death-capped wages, but also prohibited arbitrary firings. The 1388 Cambridge Statute required written service contractor protection against sudden dismissal. Apprentice rights improved. The 1421 Cologne Guild Reform limited masters' corporal punishment powers. The 1496 Nuremberg Charter established grievance procedures, an early labor relations model. International law took fledgling steps. The 1169 Alexandria Truce Agreement between Crusaders and Saladin established prisoner exchange protocols. The 1306 Hanseatic Safe Conduct System guaranteed merchant protection across territories, a precursor to diplomatic immunity. The 1454 Constantinople surrender terms demonstrated rules for honorable capitulation, sparing civilians during conquests. The 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas, mediated by the Pope, divided New World claims, establishing arbitration principles between nations. Legal scholarship flourished. The 1263 Glossator's commentary tradition systematized Roman law interpretations. The 1388 London Law French Dictionary helped standardize legal terminology. The 1475 printing of Bractons on the laws and customs of England disseminated jurisprudence beyond elites, yet accessibility remained limited. The 1492 Oxford Law Student Survey showed 90% came from noble or clerical families, as parchment gave way to printed books. These late medieval legal innovations, for all their inconsistencies, created frameworks that would enable modern legal systems. The 1503 English Star Chamber procedural rules, though later infamous, established regularized court procedures. The 1512 Nuremberg jury reform standardized 12-member panels. Even the much maligned Spanish Inquisition's meticulous record-keeping, requiring notarized testimony since 1488, contributed to evidentiary standards. Though medieval law never resolved its central tension between authority and liberty, its final centuries planted seeds that would blossom, however unpredictably, in centuries to come. As the medieval world transitioned into the Renaissance, its legal systems reached a paradoxical zenith simultaneously, reaching new heights of sophistication while retaining shocking vestiges of barbarism. This twilight period of medieval law presents a fascinating study in contrasts, where groundbreaking juridical concepts coexisted with practices that would horrify modern sensibilities. The year 1500 serves as our vantage point to examine this legal crossroads, when Europe stood poised between its medieval past and an uncertain future. The professionalization of legal practice reached unprecedented levels. The 1495 founding of London's Lincoln's Inn established formal legal education standards. requiring 7 years study before bar admission. Courtroom procedure grew increasingly technical. The 1501 Norwich Procedural Manual listed 237 required steps for filing a property claim. Specialized legal roles emerged. The 1498 Venetian Forensic Accountant case saw financial experts testifying about fraudulent bookkeeping. Yet archaic traditions persisted. The 1502 Last Judicial Duel in Valencia saw two nobles battle over an inheritance dispute, their swords blessed by priests, as if the 13th century never ended. Legal publishing revolutionized knowledge dissemination. The 1499 printing of the Year Books, collections of English court cases dating to 1268, made precedent accessible beyond elite circles. The 1503 Nuremberg Legal Almanac helped lay people navigate court dates and statutes, yet access remained unequal. The 1505 Cambridge Law Library inventory showed 80% of volumes chained to desks, available only to faculty and wealthy students. Regional differences created confusion. The 1504 Calais customs dispute saw merchants trapped between conflicting English and French commercial laws in the contested territory. Human rights concepts made tentative appearances. The 1497 Spanish slave appeals saw an African slave win freedom by proving his baptism should nullify servitude under canon law. The 1506 London Sanitation Act mandated clean water access, an early public health measure. Yet persecution continued. The 1500 Brandenburg witch trial executed 23 women using procedures unchanged from 1400. The 1501 Prague ghetto laws renewed medieval restrictions on Jews, requiring yellow badges and banning property ownership. Property law reached new complexity. The 1498 Antwerp Commercial Code standardized international trade contracts with sophisticated clauses about risk allocation. The 1502 Florentine Land Registry introduced modern cadastral surveying techniques to resolve boundary disputes. Water rights were formalized. The 1504 Milan Aqueduct case balanced agricultural and industrial needs with environmental considerations ahead of its time. Yet feudal remnants lingered. The 1503 English Feudal Incidents Act still allowed lords to confiscate estates under certain conditions. Criminal justice showed similar contradictions. The 1499 Bologna prison reform introduced hygiene standards and work programs, yet the 1501 Venetian interrogation manual still endorsed torture for obstinate suspects. The 1500 Nuremberg jury reform established 12-member panels resembling modern juries, while the same cities. 1502 witch trial protocols allowed convictions based on dreams and spectral evidence. The 1505 Spanish Inquisition guidelines mandated defense counsel yet prohibited lawyers from challenging the inquisitors. Authority, commercial law raced ahead of other fields. The 1496 Antwerp Bourse rules created standardized trading procedures still recognizable to modern financiers. The 1501 Lisbon Marine Insurance Code calculated premiums using actuarial data about pirate attacks and storm frequencies. The 1504 Augsburg Bankruptcy Statute introduced debt restructuring concepts that would resurface in modern Chapter 11 proceedings. Yet personal debt punishment remained medieval. The 1503 London debtors' prison riot erupted over conditions where inmates starved unless relatives brought food. Women's legal status saw incremental progress. The 1499 Florentine dowry reform allowed wives to reclaim dowries after abusive marriages. The 1502 Paris merchant widow case recognized a woman's right to continue her late husband's business. Yet the 1505 English Coverture Reaffirmation Act maintained that marriage erased a woman's legal identity, a principle unchanged since the 12th century. The 1501 Salzburg Witchcraft Decree specifically targeted disobedient wives as likely Satanists. Labor protections made halting progress. The 1498 Cologne Apprentice Charter limited workdays to 14 hours, considered progressive then. The 1500 London Servant Rights Act prohibited arbitrary beatings of domestic workers. The 1504 Venetian Glassblower Health Code provided compensation for workplace injuries, yet covered only free labourers, not slaves. Guilds maintained iron control. The 1502 Paris tailors' strike ended with leaders' hands being nailed to the city gates. International law developed remarkably. The 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas, mediated by Pope Alexander VI, divided the New World between Spain and Portugal, using an imaginary line, establishing principles of diplomatic arbitration. The 1502 Hanseatic Safe Conduct System guaranteed merchant protection across warring territories, a precursor to modern diplomatic immunity. The 1505 Constantinople capitulation terms showed rules for honorable surrender that spared civilians. Though the 1501 fall of Malaga had seen its Muslim population enslaved despite surrender terms, legal technology made surprising advances. The 1499 Venetian court transcription system used shorthand to create verbatim records. The 1503 Nuremberg Evidence Catalogue organized exhibits using numbered tags and storage boxes, a system still used today. The 1505 Florentine forensic sketch employed an artist to reconstruct a murder victim's face from skeletal remains, an early forensic technique. Yet trial by combat remained admissible evidence in some regions until 1507. Legal scholarship flourished while remaining elitist. The 1501 Bologna Law School curriculum introduced case study methods still used in modern legal education. The 1504 Paris Jurist Debate Society hosted intellectual exchanges about legal philosophy, though membership required noble birth. The 1506 Oxford Law Printing Project began mass-producing legal text, yet priced them at a craftsman's monthly wage per volume as the first decade of the 16th century closed. Medieval law stood at a crossroads. In commercial hubs like Antwerp and Florence, modern concepts of contracts and property rights were already taking shape. In backward regions, trial by ordeal persisted under different names. The 1507 London legal census perfectly captured this contradiction. Reporting that while the city now had 200 professionally trained lawyers, the most frequently consulted legal expert remained a blind fortune teller near Cheapside, who determined guilt by chicken entrails. This transitional period's greatest legacy may be its demonstration that legal systems evolve unevenly field by field, region by region, with some areas racing forward while others remain mired in the past. As quill pens recorded these final medieval legal developments, they unknowingly drafted the opening chapters of our modern legal world, one where the tension between progress and tradition would remain forever unresolved, perpetually demanding our vigilance and reform. The final gasps of medieval jurisprudence present a fascinating paradox. Just as its most progressive elements were birthing modern legal systems, its most archaic aspects were experiencing grotesque revivals. This twilight period between 1550–1550 saw legal reformers and reactionaries locked in ideological combat, their struggles leaving an indelible mark on Western legal tradition that still echoes in courtrooms. Today, legal education underwent revolutionary changes. The 1517 Wittenberg law curriculum, introduced by Luther's colleague Andreas Bodenstein, eliminated canon law studies, focusing instead on Roman civil codes, a radical break that saw enrollment triple within 5 years. The 1523 Bourget method in France pioneered case-based learning, while the 1528 Salamanca legal humanism movement incorporated ethics into jurisprudence. Yet these advances excluded most. The 1530 Heidelberg student register shows 90% of law students still came from noble or patrician families. Practical training improved. The 1535 London Inns of Court apprenticeship required courtroom observation, but women remained barred until 1919. Courtroom procedure modernized in fits and starts. The 1515 Augsburg Evidence Code established chain of custody rules for concept previously unknown. The 1521 Civil Court transcription system introduced verbatim record-keeping using specialized scribes. Yet supernatural evidence persisted. The 1532 Constitutio Criminalis Carolina, Germany's first unified criminal code, still accepted witchcraft spectral evidence and mandated torture for certain crimes. England's 1534 Treason Act made even thinking rebellious thoughts a capital offence. Medieval concept dressed in Renaissance legalese. Human rights saw both advances and shocking The 1516 Spanish laws of Burgos theoretically protected New World natives while establishing African slavery protocols. The 1525 Peasants' War Manifesto demanded equality before its authors were brutally executed. The 1537 Papal Bull Sublimis Deus declared indigenous peoples true humans, deserving liberty, ignored by Spanish colonists who needed slave labor. Meanwhile, the 1531 English Vagrancy Act authorized branding the poor with V for vagrant, a practice unchanged since 1388. Property law became increasingly sophisticated. The 1529 Antwerp Commercial Court rulings established modern bankruptcy discharge principles. The 1538 Florentine Land Survey introduced mathematical precision to boundary disputes. Yet feudal remnants clung stubbornly. The 1540 English Wills Act still prohibited married women from bequeathing property without husband's consent. The 1545 Venetian Patent Office granted 17-year monopolies, while the 1549 English Enclosure Acts stripped peasants of traditional common land rights. Criminal punishment philosophies diverged sharply. The 1519 Barcelona prison reform introduced vocational training, yet the 1534 London execution spectacles drew record crowds to see traitors hanged, drawn and quartered. The 1528 Naples Penal Code abolished torture, while the 1530 Venetian Interrogation Manual described new techniques like the Venetian rack. The 1547 English abolition of boiling ended cooking poisoners alive but burning. Heretics continued until 1612. Legal publishing democratized. The 1508 Paris Legal Press printed affordable statute books, selling 3,000 copies of the 1510 Custom of Paris versus 300 handwritten copies in 1480. The 1529 Lion Law Glossary translated Latin terms for Le Pepeliette. The 1533 Catholic Index banned many legal texts as heretical. The 1545 Wittenberg legal pamphlets spread Reformation legal ideas, while the 1549 English Law, French Preservation Act maintained elite legalese barriers. Women's legal status saw contradictory developments. The 1521 Geneva Divorce Reform allowed women to initiate separations but not remarry. The 1539 French Dowry Protection Act safeguarded wives' assets, while the 1540 English witchcraft statute made bewitching a husband capital felony. The 1542 Scottish Women's Testimony Act finally permitted female witnesses, except in witchcraft cases where their frail nature made them unreliable. Labour law reflected changing economic realities. The 1514 Antwerp Apprentice Charter established 8-hour workday limits for miners unenforced until 1802. The 1525 German peasant ordinances briefly abolished serfdom before being crushed militarily. The 1538 English guild reform allowed some female guild membership in, traditionally, feminine trades like silkweaving only. The 1549 Venetian glassblower patent granted lifetime monopolies to master craftsmen while denying journeymen collective bargaining rights. International law struggled with new global realities. The 1526 Sepolia Treaty established modern diplomatic immunity concepts. The 1532 Vittoria Lectures at Salamanca pioneered international human rights theory regarding indigenous peoples. Yet the 1542 new laws of the Indies protecting natives were largely ignored, while the 1547 English Slave Trade Charter commodified human lives with ruthless efficiency. Legal technology made surprising leaps. The 1518 Nuremberg evidence chest featured numbered compartments and wax seals of forensic first. The 1531 Venetian court artist created crime scene sketches with perspective techniques. The 1540 Augsburg legal clock timed courtroom proceedings. Yet the 1545 English Witchfinder's Kit included medieval devil spotting lenses alongside modern torture tools. Legal professions became more structured and exclusive. The 1512 English Sergeant Sitala created formal rankings within the bar. The 1524 Paris Advocates' Oath introduced ethical standards while barring not. The 1539 Notaries' Public Act standardized document authentication yet required. Latin fluency few possessed. The 1545 Venetian legal brokers mediated between merchants charging fees that priced out small traders. As medieval law faded, its dual legacy became clear. The 1550 Heidelberg legal inventory found 60% of regional codes still contained unreformed medieval elements alongside progressive reforms. The 1553 London Law Census revealed that while commercial courts operated with Renaissance efficiency, manor courts still adjudicated peasant disputes using 13th century customs. This uneven transformation explains why modern legal systems retain such contradictory elements. Our courtrooms still echo with both the enlightened and barbaric impulses of this pivotal era.